Chris from Hockey Tutorial here, and today in this video I wanted to take a look at some of the most popular equipment in the NHL, specifically skates. We're going to be touching on sticks a little bit. If you want us to film a specific video about sticks, comment down below and we'll make that happen, but predominantly going to be looking at skates in this one. Now, to get the information, or the most accurate information on what is the most popular equipment in the NHL currently, of course, these websites out there like Gear Geek who do a great job of cataloging what players are using throughout the seasons. But of course, we can also communicate directly with the manufacturers themselves to see the changes over the last few years of what equipment is popular, why, who's using what. It's always an interesting thing to see over the years. Now, what I wanted to touch on in this video is when you go onto a website like Gear Geek and you see the different percentages of what equipment is popular in the NHL, sticks, skates, it's very clear, very clear who's in the lead at the moment. And that is, of course, when we look at skates, it is Bauer hands down. When we look at sticks, it's much closer, give or take 1 or 2 in terms of percent, and you're pretty much level pegging with Bauer and CCM. But skates, the percentages are much more substantial. To round things off, 68% for the NHL in terms of player usage for Bauer skates versus 21% with CCM. Now, what does that mean? When you look at it in terms of just the raw numbers without any context or data behind them, they can tell quite a misleading story in the sense that this isn't me trying to take away from Bauer. Like, they are winning right now, and that's how it is. I have no issue with that. And you guys know for a fact that I always take my hat off to manufacturers when they do a good job. Just to highlight, Bauer, Mark skates, ultrasonic skates, some of the best skates I've ever seen produced. So I just want to say that right off the bat before I jump into this. But when you look at those numbers, 68% versus 21%, 68 in favor of Bauer, 21% in favor of CCM. What do those numbers mean? Now, in terms of who is making the best equipment and the correlation between the players using that in the NHL, it's not as clean cut as you might think. I filmed a video a year or so back where I explained why NHL players are not always using the best equipment available. There are numerous reasons behind that. We touched on different categories in terms of endorsement deals that players have, which means that, you know, player A has to skate in brand A, and you're never going to see them using anything other than that because they're endorsed or sponsored or powered by that particular manufacturer. From there, it was also player preference, because of course we know that some players are incredibly specific about what equipment they use and why. We even see trends of players using equipment that's not even manufactured anymore, but because that top tier NHL player wants it, the manufacturers grudgingly have to continue to produce it for that player, or maybe a handful of players that have a similar preference. And also on the subject of player preference, we've heard this numerous times from NHL players where they bought out as many of a particular product in their spec that they could get their hands on just to make sure that they didn't run out of it. So player preference is a big thing. We've heard this from a couple of the NHL players that we filmed videos with, including Peter Forsberg, who did this exact same thing. I'll clip that interview in this video, and I'll also link it up above and down below in the description so you can see that full video that we shot with A. Kane in Sweden. Actually, it was Switzerland, but I'll link that down below so you can check that out, because the player preference thing is a serious thing. And when you see players buying out 30 pairs of skates in their spec just to make sure they've got enough to last them a few years, it's a real serious thing. I'll link that down below so you can check that out. Now, and of course, from there's also the case of equipment masking, which is something that more and more players are becoming much more familiar and aware of. Now, that's essentially where product A might be masked or have a skin on top of it to look like a specific product, but underneath it could be something completely different. This is something that we've seen throughout the NHL. A lot of players or a lot of hockey fans have started to catch on to it. There's a lot of trends and threads out there that you can find that kind of go into the specifics about what equipment is actually being masked with what equipment. If you're familiar with any kind of like big ones out there, comment down below. But there's a lot that we've seen and held ourselves, some that Tommy actually even has right now, that of course we aren't going to be able to film or discuss in detail, because at the end of the day, it's not something that players regularly can walk into a store or get online and order. So it's not something that we feel is necessary to make a video about, although we'd probably really like to. I'm sure there'd be some hindrances about why we wouldn't be allowed to do that. But equipment masking is something that has happened, you know, since the start of NHL creating licenses for manufacturers to have to pay to have their logos featured in NHL games. So that's an entire kind of video that we could film in itself. But those are the three main things: player preference, equipment masking, and of course endorsements, sponsorships. That's kind of what affects what players are using. Now, on top of that, when you look at player preferences, I'll link the video that I filmed a few years ago that goes into more detail about this, but you can split that category into further categories in terms of the players that are happy to try anything new that will give them a performance edge on the ice, You've got players that will grudgingly try something new, perhaps if they've had a couple of, bad games or a bad season and they really need to try and do something to elevate their game, but they don't really want to, but if they have to, they will. Then there's the players that will absolutely, under no circumstances, move or shift from the equipment that they're using. So everyone that plays hockey could probably fit into one of three of those groups. So it'd be fun if you comment down below, let me know which one you fit into as a player. It'd be cool to compare how adaptable you guys are to try new things, or do you like to stick to what you know? If it works, don't break it. Let me know in the comments down below. But now when we come back to the point of the equipment that seems to have the higher player usage numbers in the NHL, might not specifically be the best. And again, not taking a shot at Bauer, just explaining some context behind the numbers. What I mean by this is, just because a lot of players are using something, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best thing. We see a lot of examples of this. Again, player preference. It could be a really, really big decider in why players are using something. Now, when we look at the way that the game has evolved over the years in terms of the equipment that shows the most prominence in the NHL, if we go back 10, 15 years, unequivocally, Bauer was manufacturing some of the best equipment you could get your hands on, especially when we look at skates. And it's why, if we go back, the usage of Bauer in the NHL was much higher than it actually is now. Now, although it looks like it's crazy that it's 68% in favor of Bauer, only 21% in favor of CCM, 10% in favor of True, what does that actually mean? Now, when we go back and we look at some of the best NHL players that have existed over the last sort of 10, maybe 15 years max, if you look at what those players were using, 9 times out of 10, they were probably in Bauer skates. The majority of them were. Of course, we had more options with skates back then. Graf were around, a couple of other brands around that we don't see around today. But Bauer was incredibly heavy in terms of player numbers if we go back just a few years. Now, a lot of players that are in the NHL right now, if we look at what the players that they looked up to while they were kids were using, this could also be a direct correlation to why they're in what they're using now. On top of that, keeping in mind what I said about which brands were popular a few years ago, when we look at brands like Bauer and how heavy their usage was just a few years ago in the NHL compared to what we see today, you could also argue the fact that some of these players that are in the NHL right now, what were their parents using? A lot of players really, got into the game through their, their parents or their dad taking them out to the ponds. That's where they developed a love for the game. We've heard these stories time and time again when we've actually interviewed NHL players. Those parents, the majority of those parents were in Bauer skates. Now, when we look at what the, NHL players on the TV that they were watching were in, again, probably were in Bauer skates, the majority of the players they were watching. So there's another kind of category that comes in that affects what players are using today in the NHL and why, which is trends and also influence. The trend being Bauer was the brand that everyone knew that was the rock steady brand to go for in hockey. So naturally, a lot of players are going to, by default, be drawn to that name because of how much power, how much influence, how much security was attached with that name. Now, that's kind of touching on the trend side of things. Now, when we look at the influence side of things, that comes down to what I said earlier on about the NHL players that are in the game today. Who do they look up to? What equipment were they using? What skates were they using? That's where the influence side of things comes in. Now, of course, me being a player that predominantly skates in CCM and True skates, my children who also play hockey, what do you think they're going to be using? Chances are it's going to be CCM or True. And that's going to be because I've directly influenced their choices of what they're going to buy. Because, if I have a particular brand of skates that I am a really big fan of, a particular brand that I love the product of, I love the people behind that brand, that's kind of going to rub off on my children as well. And I'm going to directly influence what they use. Now, although we see numbers like 68% for Bauer, 21% for CCM and 10% for True, those numbers are actually quite surprising for me. I actually think that I'm seeing higher usage in the NHL from brands like CCM and True than I actually expected to see. Now, my prediction for the way that this is going to change over time is brands like CCM and True, specifically CCM, we're going to start to see more usage numbers creeping up. And that's going to be because that influence, that trend is going to start then to switch, because the players that are going to be in the NHL in the next few years are going to be exposed to and influenced by and see trends from different players using different brands, different skates that we might not have seen just a few years ago. And that is then going to have a direct impact on what we see those numbers saying just a few years down the line. One thing I do have to mention is 10% usage in the NHL from True is a massive amount, in my opinion. When you consider how old Bauer hockey is, when you VS that against how old CCM hockey is, and then you look at how old True is, them having 10% presence in the NHL is a massive, massive step for a brand that has not been in the game anywhere near as long as the other two giants. Now, something else that's going to probably happen over the years is we know we've heard whispers of what's going on with Warrior and their skate production, and also based on what I've heard directly, Graph as well. It'd be interesting to see what's going to happen with that. That's about the most I can say about that, but we'll have videos that will explain this in a bit more detail later down the line. So when you put those things aside in terms of who's being influenced to use what was the Rocksteady brand that players are kind of by default generically programmed to look at the equipment by, because that's what their father skated in, that's what their favorite NHL player skated in when they were growing up. So naturally those are the products and that's the brand they're gonna by default want to go with. When you put all of that aside and you look at skate production today, a few years ago, I could say this hand on heart and not even feel like anyone will take this the wrong way. CCM was simply not making skates that were on par with what Bauer was doing. Now, today, right now, if we look at specifically the FT6 Pro, that skate in terms of performance and features is above anything that Bauer is making right now. The only thing that is comparable to that is the Mark skate from Bauer, which I really, really rate. Top 3 skates for myself in no particular order would be the Bauer Mark skate, True's Catalyst 9X skate, and then CCM's FT6 Pro skate. Those, in terms of retail skates, those 3 are the ones that I feel are absolutely crushing it. I don't take anything away from what Bauer has done with the Mark skate, and what's going to be next in terms of the Shadow skate, I'm interested to see that in more detail, to see if they've elevated what they've done or if they're kind of sitting where the previous generation, the Mark skate, was. But that will be another video that we'll touch on. So I'm not taking away from what Bauer has done, but CCM has grown so much as a manufacturer. It's not a little stride that they've taken, it's monumental, and the quality of what they're producing in terms of skates today versus just a few years ago is clear as night and day. Now, while their skates are incredible and should have way more representation and presence in the NHL, that's something that we're going to see, provided CCM continues to do what they're doing correctly, that's something that we're going to see speak for itself as time goes on, and players kind of open up to trying new things, and players are slowly influenced into trying new skates, new products from different manufacturers. But that's why, in my opinion, you see such a difference in the usage when we look at skates. When we look at sticks, the numbers are much, much closer in terms of CCM and Bauer. Give or take just a couple percent, the numbers are very, very close. And it's because a stick is something that's a lot easier for a player to pick up, try something from a different brand, and adapt to. Whereas skates, that's what connects us to the ice. That requires a lot more of a leap of faith, and a lot of players are unwilling, especially in the NHL, are unwilling to switch a brand of skates out based on what the market is saying, that this is a new pair of skates that's going to be incredibly good for your performance. It's unlikely that players are going to be very willing to switch to a completely new skate from a new manufacturer. But sticks, it's something that everyone can adapt to much quicker, and it's why you see those numbers so close versus what we see with skates. Now, it's going to take longer with skates, but I think we're going to see a similar trend happening where the numbers are going to come much closer together and not be, there's not going to be such a margin between what we see in terms of representation from different brands in the NHL. But this is like a food for thought kind of thing that I was toying with in my head, because I wanted to create a video that looked at the most popular gear in the NHL, and I felt like this was something that needed to be addressed first before we do that video. But hopefully you've enjoyed this, guys. I'd love to hear your feedback down below in the comment section. If you agree with me, if you think what I'm saying is completely wrong, comment down below and let me know what your thoughts are, what your feedback is. I'd love to continue this chat in the comment section. But thank you for watching, guys. Keep subscribing, thumb up the video if you enjoyed this, or thumbs up on the video if you enjoyed this. That probably sounds a little bit better than what I said previously, but thank you for watching, guys, and take care till next time. Peace.